Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the EU's AI Act. This is a big one, folks, a real landmark piece of legislation, and it's setting the stage for how we think about AI globally. We've got a whole bunch of research articles and reports all about the Act, and we're going to break it all down for you.
It's pretty amazing to see this level of detail. This
Well,
isn't just some vague guidelines or anything. It's like a full-on legal framework,
yeah.
specifically for AI, managing how it's developed, how it's used, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big deal.
Yeah.
I'm excited to get into the nuts and bolts of it. So let's start with the basics. What is the EU actually trying to achieve with this AI Act? What's the big picture goal here?
Well, the EU is really pushing this idea of trustworthy AI. Basically,
Yeah.
they want to make sure that as AI gets more and more integrated into our lives, it's done in a way that respects people's rights. It's got to be safe, it's got to be transparent, all of that good stuff.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like laying the groundwork, making sure we have a solid foundation before things get too out of hand. But AI is complex. How do you even start regulating something that's constantly evolving?
Right. That's where their risk-based approach comes in. They've broken down AI systems into 4 different risk levels, and each level has its own set of rules and obligations. The highest level is called unacceptable risk, and this covers systems that are seen as a clear threat to safety or fundamental rights. Things like government-run social scoring systems, those are completely banned under the Act.
Wow, a complete ban on social scoring. That's a pretty strong statement right there. It definitely shows how seriously the EU is taking this whole thing.
Yeah.
So what about the other risk categories? What are we looking at there?
So the next level down is high risk. This one covers a lot of different AI applications that are used in really important areas like healthcare, education, even law enforcement. You're talking AI systems that are used for hiring decisions, diagnosing diseases, things like that.
So basically the kinds of AI systems where the stakes are pretty high and there's real potential for harm if things go wrong.
Exactly. And for these high-risk systems, the Act sets some pretty strict rules for the companies developing them. Things like rigorous risk assessments, making sure the data quality is top-notch, detailed documentation, all sorts of things.
So it's not just about stopping the development of AI that could be harmful. It's also about making sure even the beneficial AI is developed and used responsibly.
That's the idea. It's about guiding the whole life cycle of these high-risk systems from design to deployment and beyond.
Sounds like a pretty involved process. Can you give us an example of what this will look like in the real world? Say a company is developing a new AI-powered medical diagnosis tool. What would they need to do to comply with the Act?
Okay, so let's say we have a company that's developing an AI system that helps doctors diagnose skin cancer from images. Under the AI Act, this would definitely fall under the high-risk category.
Okay, so what are the first steps they'd need to take?
Well, before they can even think about launching their tool, they need to conduct a really thorough risk assessment. This means identifying all the potential harms, like misdiagnosis or any bias in the AI's recommendations. They also need to prove that their AI has been trained on a huge and diverse data set of images to avoid any bias creeping in.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want the AI to be more accurate for certain skin tones than others, for example.
Exactly. And they also need to build in systems for human oversight. So doctors can review the AI's recommendations and make the final call. It's not just about the technology itself either. They also need to be super clear with healthcare professionals about how the AI tool works, its limitations, and how important that human oversight is.
So it's about creating a system where AI is assisting doctors, not replacing them.
Precisely. And even once the tool is out there in the world, the company's responsibilities don't stop there. They need to keep monitoring its performance, collect data on its accuracy, and fix any issues that pop up.
So it's like a constant feedback loop, making sure the AI is doing what it's supposed to and catching any problems early on.
Exactly. Now, the Act also goes into other areas like biometric identification. Generally speaking, it bans the use of things like facial recognition in public spaces for law enforcement.
Wow, that's a big one. I know facial recognition has been a hot topic lately. Lots of debate about how it could be misused. Sounds like the EU is drawing a line in the sand.
Yeah, they are. There are a few limited exceptions, like using facial recognition to find a missing child or prevent a terrorist attack. But even those are super strictly regulated and need special authorization.
Okay, so the message is clear. Biometric data is sensitive stuff, and it needs to be handled with extreme care.
Exactly. And they're also tackling those big general purpose AI models,
Yeah.
the ones that can be adapted to do all sorts of different tasks.
Oh, right. Those are the ones like ChatGPT, right?
Yeah, those are the ones. Those systems are incredibly powerful, but they also come with unique challenges when it comes to transparency and accountability.
So how does the Act deal with those challenges?
Well, they're bringing in specific transparency obligations for all of those general purpose models. The developers will need to provide detailed information about how they train the models, what data was used, how they actually function, all that stuff. This is crucial for understanding how these models make decisions and for spotting any potential biases.
So it's about building trust in these powerful AI systems, especially as they become more and more part of our everyday lives. But what about safety? How do we make sure these big AI models are being used responsibly?
The Act goes a step further by requiring extra risk management measures for the really powerful and impactful models. Think of the models that are being used to control critical infrastructure or making big decisions in healthcare or finance. Those models will be subject to self-assessment mitigation of systemic risks and really tough cybersecurity requirements.
So it's like building a safety net around these powerful AI systems to prevent any unintended consequences. But I'm curious, all of this sounds incredibly complex. How is the EU planning to enforce all of these regulations? I mean, how do you actually make sure everyone is following the rules?
That's one of the big questions surrounding the AI Act. It's one thing to write down the rules, but actually getting everyone to follow them is a whole other challenge. So to deal with that now, they've set up the European AI Office. They're going to be the ones overseeing the implementation and enforcement of the Act.
So basically a dedicated team making sure everyone is playing by the rules.
Exactly. And to get people on board early on, they've also launched the AI Pact. It's a voluntary initiative for AI developers to show they're committed to developing AI responsibly.
So it sounds like the EU is really trying to set the stage for a future where AI is a force for good.
Absolutely. But like with any ambitious plan, there are going to be some bumps in the road.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of challenges are we talking about?
Well, for one thing, AI is a field that's constantly changing. Keeping the Act up to date and adaptable to all the new advancements is going to be a constant challenge. And then there's the question of enforcement, especially when it comes to companies that aren't even based in Europe.
Right, how do you hold companies accountable when they're operating outside of the EU's jurisdiction? And how do you strike that balance between regulation and innovation? We don't want to stifle creativity in the name of safety.
Those are some of the big questions that will need to be answered as the AI Act goes into effect. But one thing's for sure, the EU has fired the starting gun in this global race to regulate AI. And the whole world is watching to see how it plays out.
This is fascinating stuff, and I'm sure our listeners are already thinking about how the AI Act might affect them directly. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about some real-world examples. Can you walk us through some specific scenarios of how the AI Act might play out in different industries?
Absolutely. Let's start with the financial sector. Imagine a bank is using an AI system to assess loan applications. Under the AI Act, this would likely fall into the high-risk category because it could have a big impact on people's livelihoods.
Okay, so how would the Act apply in that case? What would the bank need to do to make sure they're compliant?
Well, they'd need to do a very thorough risk assessment to identify any potential bias in the AI system. Making sure the AI isn't unfairly denying loans to certain people based on their gender, ethnicity, or where they live. They'd also need to make sure the AI's decision-making process is transparent and explainable so people can understand why they were approved or denied.
That makes a lot of sense. Transparency is key when it comes to financial decisions that can have such a big impact on people's lives. What about other industries? Where else are we seeing the AI Act having an impact?
Another interesting example is recruitment. Lots of companies are now using AI tools to screen job applicants. But those tools have been criticized for perpetuating existing biases.
I've heard stories of AI systems filtering out perfectly qualified candidates just because their resumes didn't have the right keywords or because of their zip code.
Exactly. So the AI Act aims to address these problems by forcing companies to make sure their AI hiring tools are fair and unbiased. They'd need to prove that the data used to train those tools is representative of all the different types of applicants, and that the AI isn't making decisions based on things like race, gender, or religion.
It sounds like the AI Act is trying to make sure that AI is used to create a fairer, more equitable society, not make existing inequalities worse.
Yes, that's one of the core principles of the Act. It's not just about preventing harm, it's about actively promoting fairness and justice in this new age of AI.
This is really fascinating stuff, and I'm sure our listeners are starting to grasp just how far-reaching this legislation is. But before we go too much further, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a flash to dive even deeper into some of the nuances of the AI Act and what it means for the future of AI globally. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were looking at how the AI Act could really shake things up in industries like finance and recruitment. It's clear the EU is serious about this, but it does raise some big questions about what this means for AI on a global scale.
Definitely. I mean, how does the EU plan to enforce this act on companies that aren't even based in Europe? That seems tricky.
It's a huge challenge for sure. The EU can definitely regulate companies operating within its borders, but trying to control AI development globally, that's a whole different ballgame.
Right. What if a company, let's say in Brazil, develops an AI tool that ends up being used by businesses in the EU? How does the act apply in that situation?
That's where things get interesting. The Act does have provisions for companies outside the EU, especially if their AI systems are impacting people within the EU.
So even if you're not based in Europe, if your AI is being used there, you still need to comply with the act.
In many cases, yes, especially for those high-risk AI systems we were talking about earlier.
That makes sense. I mean, the EU can't just ignore it if an AI system developed elsewhere is potentially causing harm within its borders.
Exactly. But enforcing these regulations on a global scale, that's a massive undertaking. It's going to require a lot of cooperation with other countries and international organizations.
So it sounds like the EU is hoping to set a global standard with this act, maybe hoping other countries will follow their lead and adopt similar regulations.
That's definitely the goal. And we're already seeing some of that happening. Other countries like the US and Canada are starting to develop their own AI regulations, and they're definitely drawing inspiration from the EU's approach.
It's like the EU has thrown down the gauntlet, challenging the rest of the world
Yeah.
to really think about the ethical and societal impacts of AI.
Yeah, and it's sparked a global conversation about how we govern this technology responsibly. But even if other countries do adopt similar regulations, there's still the question of how to keep up with AI. It's evolving so rapidly.
That's what I was thinking. AI is changing so fast. How can any regulation possibly keep pace with all that innovation?
It's a valid concern. The AI Act does have some flexibility built in, to adapt to future advancements, but it will require constant review and updates.
It's like a constant game of catch-up, isn't it? As soon as you think you've got a handle on AI, something new comes along and changes the whole game.
Absolutely. And that's why research and collaboration are going to be so important. The EU needs to work closely with researchers, developers, and everyone involved to stay ahead of the curve and anticipate new challenges.
It sounds like a never-ending process, but a crucial one if we want to make sure AI is being used for good.
Precisely. And this is where the AI Act's focus on trustworthy AI becomes even more important.
Right, because if people don't trust AI, they're not going to use it no matter how beneficial it could be.
Exactly. Building trust requires transparency, accountability, and showing that AI is being developed ethically.
It's about striking that balance between encouraging innovation and protecting our values.
Yes, and that balance isn't always easy to find. There are legitimate concerns that too much regulation could stifle innovation, especially for startups and smaller companies that might not have the resources to deal with all the compliance requirements.
So how do we find that sweet spot? How do we encourage innovation while also protecting against potential harm?
That's the million-dollar question. It requires open dialogue, collaboration, and a willingness to adapt as we learn more about what AI can do and where its limitations are.
It seems like the EU's AI Act is a big step in the right direction, but it's really just the start of a much bigger conversation.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that everyone needs to be a part of, from the developers and policymakers to everyday people who will be affected by the rise of AI.
Speaking of everyday people, let's bring it back to our listeners for a minute.
Yeah.
How might the AI Act impact their lives even if they're not directly involved in developing or deploying AI systems?
Well, at its core, the AI Act is designed to protect individuals from the potential harms of AI. That means ensuring that AI systems used in things like healthcare, finance, and employment are fair, unbiased, and transparent.
So even if someone isn't an AI expert, they can be confident that the AI systems they're interacting with have been developed and deployed responsibly.
Exactly. The Act aims to create a framework of trust, so people can feel confident that their rights and interests are being protected as AI becomes more and more integrated into our lives.
It's about creating a future where AI is a force for good, not something to be afraid of.
Yes, and it's going to take all of us working together. We all have a role to play in shaping the future of AI by staying informed, asking the tough questions, and demanding that this technology is developed and used responsibly.
This has been a fascinating exploration of the EU's AI Act. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the specifics of the Act itself to its broader implications for the future of AI globally.
And we've really only scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack, and we encourage our listeners to keep exploring this topic and keep those conversations going.
I totally agree. But before we jump into some of the resources we've gathered for our listeners, there's one more aspect of the AI Act I want to touch on, and that's its potential impact on the competitive landscape.
Ah, yes, the economics of AI regulation. That's where things get really interesting.
Exactly. Some experts are arguing that the AI Act could actually give European companies a competitive advantage in the global AI race.
It's a compelling argument. By setting these clear standards for trustworthy AI, the EU could create a market where consumers and businesses prioritize AI systems that have been developed responsibly and ethically.
So it's not just about preventing harm. It's also about giving a leg up to companies that are committed to ethical AI development.
Precisely. And this could lead to a sort of race to the top, where companies all over the world are trying to meet or exceed the EU's standards in order to stay competitive.
That's a really interesting idea. But on the flip side, there are also concerns that the Act's strict requirements could make it harder for European startups and smaller companies to compete with those bigger, more established players.
That's a valid point, for sure. It's a delicate balance, finding that sweet spot where you have high standards, but also a level playing field where innovation can thrive.
It's like the EU is walking a tightrope, trying to find that perfect balance between regulation and innovation.
It's a tough balancing act, and one that will need constant adjustments as the AI landscape continues to evolve.
Well, it's clear that the EU's AI Act is a game changer, and its impact will be felt far beyond Europe's borders.
It's a fascinating and complex topic, and one that we'll be keeping a close eye on here at the Deep Dive. But before we wrap up, let's shift gears and take a look at some resources we've put together for our listeners who want to learn more.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It's time to look at how the AI Act is making a real difference in the world.
It's exciting to see these regulations in action, and one area where we see change is AI auditing.
AI auditing, that's a new one for me. What exactly is that?
It's a brand new field growing super fast. Specialized firms are popping up to help companies navigate the AI Act and make sure they're following all the rules.
So like financial auditors, but for AI, making sure everything is above board.
Exactly. They go through AI systems with a fine-tooth comb looking at everything. Data quality bias, mitigation, transparency, human oversight, you name it. They help companies spot potential risks, create the necessary documentation, and set up processes for ongoing compliance.
Sounds like a pretty essential service, especially for companies working on those high-risk AI systems.
Yeah.
I bet this trend is global, not just in Europe.
You're absolutely right. We're seeing huge demand for AI auditing services everywhere as more countries grapple with AI regulations. The EU's AI Act is setting a precedent, and companies are realizing they need to be ready even if they're not directly subject to the regulations yet.
It's amazing how one piece of legislation can create such a global ripple effect. But let's zoom in a bit. Where are we seeing the biggest impact of the AI Act in specific industries?
One area where things are really changing is healthcare. The Act is pushing developers of AI-powered medical tools to prioritize transparency, accountability, and patient safety.
That's reassuring to hear. Healthcare is such a sensitive area with high stakes, and AI could bring huge benefits, but also serious risks.
Exactly. Take AI-powered diagnostic tools, for example. They can help doctors make quicker and more accurate diagnoses, but they have to be used responsibly.
So how does the Act address that? What kind of safety measures does it put in place?
Well, developers of these diagnostic tools have to show that their systems are trained on diverse data, that they've taken steps to minimize bias, and that they provide clear information to doctors about the tool's limitations.
So it's all about making sure these AI tools help doctors not replace them entirely.
Precisely. Doctors still need to be in control, making the final calls and using their professional judgment. The AI is there to assist, not to dictate.
That's an important point. It's about humans and AI working together, each bringing their own strengths to the table.
Exactly, and that collaborative approach is really reflected in the Act's focus on human oversight. For high-risk systems, the Act requires human involvement in the development, deployment, and monitoring of those systems.
Makes sense. We need to make sure humans stay in control, especially when AI systems can have such a big impact on people's lives.
Yes, and that human-centric approach is one of the things that makes the EU's AI Act so unique. It's not just about regulating AI, it's about shaping a future where AI works for us, not the other way around.
This has been a truly insightful deep dive. We've covered a lot, from the basic principles of the Act to its real-world impact and its potential to shape the future of AI globally. What are your final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway here is that the AI Act isn't just a European thing, it's a global story. It's about how we as a society choose to handle the challenges and opportunities of artificial intelligence. It's about finding that balance between innovation and our values.
And it's a story that's just getting started. We're bound to encounter challenges and uncertainties along the way, but one thing is for sure, the EU has started a global conversation that's absolutely crucial for shaping a future where AI is a force for good. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the EU's AI Act. We hope you found it as engaging and thought-provoking as we did. This is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for an AI-powered future that benefits us all. Until next time, happy diving.